Velkommen til dette webinaret om språkpolitikk på NTNU. Welcome to this webinar on language policies at NTNU. The webinar is part of the ongoing work of revising the language policy guidelines at NTNU. A committee has been working on this since the fall of 2021. I have the privilege of chairing this committee and to be your host today. The goal of the webinar is to create a forum for discussion. Although this is a webinar, we have solicited questions in advance, and we are grateful to everyone who took their time to send us these questions. The title of today's event is Language Choices at NTNU, Where Do We Go? And we have singled out two issues that we would like to discuss. The first one is an internal issue, namely what the balance between Norwegian and English should be in general at NTNU. Practices differ across departments and groups, and employees have different opinions about what the appropriate relationship should be. The second issue takes a more external perspective, namely what kind of language competence employers expect from our students. Does it suffice to know the technical terms in your subject in English, or are students also expected to know their Norwegian equivalents? Before we turn to the first panel, I'd like to reflect a bit on why language is important at a university. We humans are unique in our linguistic abilities. We can use language to talk about the present, the past, and the future. Language is an essential mode of communication. It enables societies, and it creates communities. It creates a sense of belonging, and it can also create a sense of exclusion. Put simply, language is an essential part of our culture, and how we use language thereby contributes to defining and shaping the culture that we have. For students and faculty alike, language is a tool for thinking and working. We communicate our ideas through language, be it through a written, spoken, or signed medium. As such, it plays an enormously important role in our work as students and researchers. Language is also related to the quality of our work. Rector Anne Borg has said that quality is a defining hallmark of NTNU's strategic objectives in the coming years. We all want to do our work with the highest quality possible, and language is therefore a key ingredient in accomplishing this goal. Therefore, NTNU needs to foster a culture for continuous linguistic development. By that I mean that we all need to continue to develop our language skills. This applies to our native language, but it also applies to our second and possibly third or fourth language. This also means that there is no endpoint when it comes to learning a language. Language learning is not simply a matter of passing an exam or reaching a predefined level like B2. All of us, native and non-native speakers alike, will always be able to learn new things about the languages that we speak. Norwegian universities have by and large adopted a policy whereby Norwegian is the main language, but we are also using English when necessary. This is often called parallel language use. We do this because we will always have many members of our community who are new to Norway, or because they have a position where they are not required to learn Norwegian. For example, PhDs and postdocs are not required to learn Norwegian, and they are not prioritized currently when it comes to courses in Norwegian. By also using English, we ensure that these employees are included into our community. This is vital. Linguistic inclusion is key to integration, inclusion in general, a good learning environment, a healthy and good work environment, including involvement in one's workplace, and of course, personal growth. For this reason, many PhDs and postdocs also want to learn Norwegian because they realize that although English gets you around, it is also crucial to learn the majority language if you want to be successfully integrated. Norway has recently instituted a new language law. This law makes it clear that Norwegian is the main working language, and it also emphasizes the role that universities have in developing and nurturing Norwegian as an academic language. Science is global and in principle independent of particular languages, yet we know that the new Latin is English. This means that it takes effort to ensure that we have a healthy academic language in Norwegian. For many years, the Language Council of Norway has been concerned about the lack of progress in this area. With the new law, we as a university have an institutional responsibility in ensuring the vitality of a Norwegian academic language, which is a prerequisite for successful science communication to the public. In sum, language is both culture and infrastructure. That's why it is vital to raise the awareness of language and language policies. One of the goals of this webinar is to do exactly that. We hope that the webinar and the discussions we will have here today will generate lots of discussion in research groups and departments across NTNU. We do not necessarily have to agree on everything, but we need to put language and language policy on the agenda. Leaders have a particular responsibility to do that, but we all need to contribute and take part in the conversation. So with that as a bit of context, let's move to the first panel debate. In this panel debate, we'll discuss how we can strike the right balance between Norwegian and English at NTNU. We are lucky to have 3 panelists with us today who all represent different perspectives on these issues. Monica Rolfsen is a professor of organizational development and currently Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management. Payal Chatterjee is a PhD candidate in the Department of Physics, where she does research on the study of low-dimensional spin structures. She's also a member of the Center of Excellence in Q-Spin, and she serves on the board of Dion. Vikas Thakur is a professor of geotechnical engineering and head of department of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's also a member of the committee, which is currently revising the language policy guidelines at NTNU. Thank you all for taking part in this webinar. I'd like to start by asking each of you to share your thoughts on the following question. From your point of view, why is it important to even discuss the balance between Norwegian and English? Is it really that important what language we use in different contexts? Monica, please.
Yes, it's important because it's there's no clear answers. It's the easy answer is it's complicated, and it's important to discuss because what we really deal with is dealing with conflicting goals, as you briefly mentioned. On the one hand, we as a university, we want everybody to be included. We want everybody to understand what's going on, the information, and so on. And to do that, English will be the answer. We also want to be an international university, and we want to increase the level of student exchange programs and student exchange students. In order to do that, we need to have English as an educational language. But on the other hand, NTNU also wants to be an integrated part of the Norwegian society. We want to be a part of the political discussion. We want to have social impact on our society. And in order to do that, more of the academic staff should communicate in Norwegian, because that's the way we can communicate with the stakeholders on a national level. We also have, as you mentioned, Terje, we have a responsibility to develop and maintain Norwegian as an academic language, to provide Norwegian to become, as was one of the debates in the newspaper, Norwegian to become sort of a kitchen table language. We don't want that to happen. So, and that also comes to with Norwegian journals and so on. So that's important. And finally, there could be many more, but I have one more point with the Norwegian is, and that's especially important in our campuses in Ålesund and Gjøvik. Also in Trondheim, but it's really important in the other campuses because their competitive advantage is to have a very close collaboration with the local businesses, local public sector, and so on. For instance, my department in Ålesund have a very, very strong collaboration with the local bank, and they have a huge amount of the staff come from all over the world. And if more than a majority of the employees do not speak Norwegian, there will be a big challenge in maintaining the close collaboration with the local businesses. So that's a few of the conflicting goals, and there's no very easy answers, so we need to compromise, I think, with the language.
Thank you. Payal, what do you think?
So I definitely agree with you. It's a very complicated topic. So as an international temporary employee, I can say that if you want to encourage international collaboration, if you want to encourage international researcher to work at NTNU, so definitely you have to discuss how much English we want to use in the workspace. And also, if you want to integrate them in the society, so definitely have to encourage them to learn Norwegian. Definitely not force them, but encourage them. And personally, I do feel that it helped me when I started learning Norwegian to feel more integrated in the society. But I definitely prefer using English in the work environment. So yeah, it's very important to have a right balance and to have an open discussion, like when should we use English and when should we use Norwegian in the university. Yeah.
Thank you. Vikas, what do you think?
I represent, it's called Institute for Bygg- og Miljøteknikk, or Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, if you will. The department consists of more than 230 staff members. And more than 50% of my staff members are non-native Norwegian. They speak other language than Norwegian. So the balance between English and Norwegian becomes a topic of discussion on a daily basis, because we want to have a functional working environment. We want to make sure that people feel included. We want to also prepare our students for the working life. So we need to find a good balance between both language. And I suppose many departments at NTNU have the similar situation, where we have a lot of international students, just like you, Payal, and they need to be included and integrated in our daily businesses.
And you talked about compromise and you talk about balance, but is there one right answer to what a compromise or a balance would mean in a given department or a given faculty? How do we find this compromise or this balance?
I think every department has to have the discussion, and I really appreciate that you bring this up to the agenda so we can have a discussion at all levels at the university, because as I mentioned a few of the conflicting goals, and for instance the close collaboration with the local industry, that will vary between different departments. It's very important in some departments, but not important at all in other departments. It has to do with the amount of people with another language. I mean, it's a lot of compromises, so I don't think we should force one answer, one percentage, Norwegian or English. But it's important to have the discussion and find a balance at each department.
Right.
I agree with Monica. It's not a yes or no question, I think. Probably we should think yes, thank you, both. And it is context dependent, I think. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I also believe it's context dependent. Like, if you have just one international person who doesn't speak Norwegian, then if you try to speak English, it feels like a compromise because it's just for one person. But you have, like, if the 40% of the people in the department is international, then it doesn't feel like a compromise and feels like a balance. So it's context dependent, definitely.
Right. And what are your experiences as an international temporary employee when it comes to NTNU's policies or practices regarding language and inclusion?
Yeah, so personally, QSPIN, my group, is very international. So we usually speak English generally during our lunchtime or meetings and everything. But I know people from other groups in physics department, there they faced some problem because they were the first non-Norwegian speaking person in the group. So there, that compromise came. And then they started telling that, okay, maybe you should start using English a little bit more often because they are temporary employees and in their job requirement, they doesn't need to speak Norwegian. So they're trying to learn it, but it takes time to learn a language, right? So I think it's a bit different in different groups. So personally, I'm very happy with the balance we have in my group. And especially on the department level also, I think it's quite nice. It's quite well balanced. But then again, it is very different in different groups.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you have also started learning Norwegian.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about why you decided to spend time on that?
I would say it's personal interest because I love to learn new languages, and I thought, okay, I'm going to stay here for 4 years, so it's definitely good to learn the language to feel more integrated in the society. My first motivation was when I go to the grocery store, I should know what I'm buying. So yeah, then I started learning the language and I enjoyed it, but it was my personal choice, definitely.
Right. Is your experience that many international PhDs would like to learn Norwegian, or does it differ wildly?
If they're here for longer period, definitely they will learn it. But if they're here just for 2 years, let's say the postdocs, then they are not that interested to learn the language because they have the research work going on. And it's quite demanding to learn a new language. And if your native language is very different from Norwegian, then it takes long time to learn the language. So I think, yeah, if it depends how long you want to stay here, it depends on that, whether you want to learn the language or not.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And from both of you, Monica and Vikas, have leadership roles, and you have a responsibility for 230 employees, and you have even more. How do you work with this issue? You mentioned that it's a daily issue, but how do you work with heads of departments and other employees in contextualizing and keeping the debate alive, as it were?
I can start.
Yes.
Lower level, then we go to higher level. At our department, we have permanent staff members. We have administrative staff, technicians. They master both Norwegian and English. They communicate mostly Norwegian because that's, in a way, most of them like to speak, but they are also mastering English. That is important. But suddenly, suddenly somebody knocks your office who wants to speak in English. Then you have to suddenly switch to English as well. That's important because suddenly we get a phone call from a student, international student, or PhD. And then we have to switch to that as well. We can't say that we will continue speaking in Norwegian. So we have to adapt to the situation. 60 to 70% of our PhDs, postdocs are from outside Scandinavia. And they need to use English to understand and to be understood. So we need to be flexible on that side. We have some consequence of that. We need to keep all our informations in both Norwegian and English. All emails, all our guidelines, presentations, document must be available both in English as well as in Norwegian. For PhDs, it's English to a large extent. It takes time. It's twice the time we need to use to have everything in 2 languages, but it is necessary to ensure inclusion and integration of our staff member. I belong to engineering field, and most of engineering courses are international. It also means in working life, one must relate to Norwegian, but also be able to interact with colleagues and partners using English. And so we try to keep the balance, but there is always a choice depending on the context. And we encourage to use Norwegian and provide language courses and a language cafe to our students and PhDs wherever there's a possibility.
Can you say a little bit more about this language cafe? How do you organize? What is it, and how do you run it?
Language cafe is organized by our research group leaders, particularly one research group leader who took the initiative a couple of years ago. Every Friday in the morning, 9 o'clock, he invites all his staff members, PhDs, postdocs, permanent staff member, have coffee and boller, Norwegian boller, on the table, and they use 1 hour, and they talk in Norwegian. They try to help each other in learning the language. And it has been a success.
So people show up and they participate.
Absolutely. And they're very motivated. So it's a success story from our department.
Can I ask a question? Is that for PhD students, or is it also for regular staff?
We invite all of them because it's important that permanent staff members also show up and support those who want to learn the language. So both PhDs and permanent staff members are invited. And we do it in small groups so that it doesn't become like conference. Inviting 200 people in a hall, it won't work. So group of 20, 25, they meet together and discuss different things. In that way, our PhDs are also learning technical terms in Norwegian as well. So it adds value beyond just learning the language.
Right, so you actually work with the Norwegian academic language in terms of technical concepts and keywords that they need to master.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And Monica, from your point of view as Dean, how do you guys work with language and the relationship between Norwegian and English?
Just have to comment first that this idea with the language cafe, that was a really good idea. So I think I will just steal the idea and implement it.
Go ahead.
So at our Faculty of Economics and Management, we have 4 different departments. So we have combinations. One department, as I mentioned, in Ålesund, they have international master programs. it's international business, so it's quite international, but at the same time they need to have, as I said, the collaboration with local business, so there's a combination. Also with the Department of Economics, it's amount of people with foreign languages, so they also communicate a lot in English. One of the other departments is mainly Norwegian, and there's also the fourth department has some combinations with different research groups and so on. I think maybe it's important to differ between the temporary staff and the regular staff, because when we hire people on a permanent basis, they have an obligation to learn Norwegian within 3 years. And that is easy to say, but it's not that easy to actually do it. So we need to organize that. I think, as you mentioned, Terje, the guidelines at NTNU is actually quite good, but maybe we have some potential to actually use it. And I think from the management side, we could be better to organize the activities for actually attending these courses. So the first thing is to actually have available language courses, and that has been a challenge a couple of times. I had one professor from Austria. I think it was about 2 years from she started, and when she was able to attend the first course, because it was fully booked and complicated. So that is priority number one. But we also need to organize to make it to make it realistic. And it depends on where you come from. If you are from Germany or the Netherlands, it's easier than from perhaps India or other parts of the globe. So maybe some people should have less teaching the first 3 years in order to actually have time to improve on the language activities. So that's important. We also try to organize. It should be very important to actually be able to attend the courses. I heard some examples where you're invited to a meeting which is simultaneously with the course, and say, "Oh, just skip the course." That should never happen. I mean, this should be priority number one. So that is a very, very important part. But it also has to follow up activities, and the language cafe is a very good example. One of my departments also has some, well, we could call it a language coach, someone who talk with the people who are training in Norwegian, like have a chat 20 minutes twice a week or something. So just to be able to practice. And then there's my last point here is I also think we all have a responsibility to talk Norwegian, even if it feels impolite. If there's someone in the room who's not fluent in Norwegian, we very easily switch to English because we feel people feel included. But if you never practice, you never have a chance to learn. So one of my employees from the Netherlands, he was really great. In 1 year, he was fluent. But he was every time someone started to talk English, he said, no, stop, talk Norwegian to me. So maybe one thing we could do was to have a T-shirt or a button, talk Norwegian to me. So if you are in that situation where you are training, I think that is an important part where we all have responsibility. And sometimes people can answer in English, but they still, it's a practice to listen to the Norwegian. So we all have a responsibility to be a practice arena.
And I think that's a really good suggestion, because I've also experienced that many people feel that they have to use one language only. So you know, everyone should either speak English or Norwegian, but there's nothing against, you know, some people speaking Norwegian and some people replying in English, as long as they understand. And that should be, we all have to adapt to that, I think, because it feels a bit strange in the beginning, but that could also be a nice learning, a nice way to learn the language when you sort of slowly develop into being able to understand and then speak it.
But when it comes to PhD students and postdocs, it's different, because maybe they don't even want to learn Norwegian, and that's okay. So then we need to provide information in English. So what we do in department meetings, sometimes if there's information, we could do a combination with having a PowerPoint presentation in English, but talk Norwegian, or the opposite. So there should be sort of combinations, compromises. And I also think it's in meetings is the most complicated thing. Yeah. So it's also different if there's pure information. It's easier to have that in English. But if we are going to discuss our future or a strategy or a working environment, I think the quality of the discussion will be poor if everybody are forced to use another language than their mother tongue. So it's also depending on what are the meeting about. So maybe we should split meetings with this is the information part when it comes to the discussion, that it could be in Norwegian. But yeah, the most important thing is to be aware of all these dilemmas and have a discussion on each department. How do we do this?
Yeah.
It's very nice points raised by Monica. I thought to just share my experience. Now going back to 2004 when I was PhD student. I applied to Norwegian course at Dragvoll quite a few times, but it was hard to get placed because we have limited number of Norwegian courses. So sometimes you as a PhD postdoc are motivated, but opportunities can be limited. That is a fact. So I couldn't learn the language that well during my PhD. I picked up a few things and I thought I can speak Norwegian, but in Norwegian is more complicated than individual things. But then I started working at Norwegian Public Road Administration. In 6 months I was speaking.
Right.
You know, and it has something to do with the learning environment that was created by that organization. They run everything in Norwegian, but they give you a very supporting environment. And that's what we should do here as well. Universities are meant to, our main job is to make others learn, our students. We are the best in providing learning environment. And we shall also create good learning environment for our staff members, temporary or permanent, at NTNU through different schemes so that they succeed in learning the Norwegian if they have willingness to do so.
Yeah, I want to add a small thing. I think a lot of PhDs are willing to learn the language. They are just worried about the limited time of their contract. So if they are spending time to learn the language, they think that they are not spending enough time for their research, and some of the supervisors are also not happy with that. So if we can solve this problem, if we can compensate with the contract, if they're trying to learn the language, I think a lot of PhDs will be more motivated to learn the language. PhDs and postdocs both, I would say. Yeah.
And I mean, there is a possibility in the current scheme because many PhDs have 4 years. That means that they have 1 year of duty work, as we call it.
Yeah.
And that duty work is typically conceived of as teaching, but it doesn't have to be teaching. It can be a range of other tasks. And you could even, in some cases at least, perhaps conceive of the duty work as a part of it to learn the language, if that's important for your project or it's important for your career objectives. So there might be possibilities that we can pursue here. And you're all touching on something that many of our listeners have submitted in advance. So we asked for questions, and we're very grateful for the questions that we got. And many of you are asking us about what do we do with department meetings. And what I'm hearing from all of you is that we need to be flexible to a certain extent and maybe use one strategy for a certain context and another strategy for a different context. Because I think many people experience, if their native language is Norwegian, it's hard to talk about human resources work in English if you don't know the terminology or you feel that you can't express your thoughts as well as you otherwise could. And if you, but of course, if you then do it only in Norwegian and you have people who haven't yet acquired the language, then they can participate, and that can create additional difficulties. So the answer is that there's not one single solution for all cases. You have to have a flexible approach, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because many people often think that there's one right answer. Either the department works in Norwegian or it works in English. And your approach is that we shouldn't think of it in such a simple way.
No, not at all.
That's true. Good. But then there are, of course, a range of practical issues. And so here's another question that we have received from the audience. And that question asks about websites. And I think Vikas touched a little bit upon this when he said that, well, we have to do everything in both languages, and that takes twice the amount of time, at least. And the question from this person is concerned about the websites that we have, and what do we do when we work with local businesses or companies where they often prefer Norwegian, and our staff will often prefer English, either because they're international or because they work in a field where all the terminology so far mostly exists in English. And then this person also claims that it's too time-consuming to do websites in both languages. And I think this is something we saw when the Language Council of Norway also criticized NTNU for only having English names for their centers of excellence. And all these centers have Norwegian names as well, but they're not frequently used. And I think part of the reason is this, that it's too time-consuming to maintain both languages. How should we think about this? Is that really true? Or do we need to invest resources in keeping all websites in two languages? Or what do you think the solution to such a dilemma should be?
Well, I think we should have just give it priority, so we need to have websites in both languages. We have all experience if you're interested in something in a French university and the websites in English are very poor. It's annoying, and I mean, we can't work like that. So the websites, official websites, we should just give it the priority needed.
Right.
There are different layers in our websites, right? The main website of NTNU's website department, that should be on both language, equally prioritized, so that we can approach to both local and internationals. But when you go further into second or third layer, for example, a master program, which targets mainly the Norwegian student, then we can prioritize Norwegian, because we know our students are from Norway. If you have international master program, then we can focus more on English to have the website, so that at least we have a website which is targeted to the right audience. Because one thing is fact, NTNU has a limited administrative resources. We can increase the resource, that is one option, but given the reduction in all those finances, it's not easy to increase administrative resources dramatically. So we need to be smarter and adapt to the situation we are in. But again, one size fit all won't work here. We see who is our target audience. If it's industry, Norwegian industry, then we should have information in Norwegian. If it's international audience target, we have more focus on English. But I can also give one dilemma which I have. We have recently established one center called Green 2050 in Grønn and now we have recruiting 23 PhD students, and then we have to prioritize something, website. And now the main website is in English, because when we have advertised PhD positions, then PhDs will look for, or candidates will look for what is Green 2050. They need more information. So we had to prepare the website first in English. And as we will go further, we will have it in Norwegian as well, so that we target both Norway as well as international audience. So sometimes it is a matter of priority due to the time limit one has. It's nothing to do with the willingness, I would say. But sometimes it can reflect like the people are not willing to have it in English or Norwegian. So it's resource dependent, time dependent.
Right. And so that might also mean that, for example, for your the Center of Excellence that you're part of, which I think has mostly the website in English, and as you said, the working language of that center is English.
Yeah.
And maybe that's okay. I mean, in that given context where the focus, I mean, I hardly understand the research that you are, or you know, the basic research that you're doing, because it's so advanced and it's such at the cutting edge of physics, and maybe we don't always need to have everything in both languages, given that there are different purposes for different things.
Yeah, I definitely agree with him. When your resources are limited, you have to prioritize. So based on your audience and your priority, you have to decide which content should be in English or both in Norwegian and English, definitely. Yeah.
Right. And it might also be possible to have a simple Norwegian version of a Center of Excellence where you try to explain at least to the layperson or the non-expert what this is basically about. And for those who want more information, then you can have an English version. Monica.
Yes, I understand. It can be time consuming, and if the main audience is English-speaking audience, it doesn't seem to be so necessary. But still, being a part of a Norwegian society, it should be able to read and communicate with the politicians, the society level. So at least a summary or smaller part. So it has to do with our role as being a part of the society and not being sort of an ivory tower. So if we really mean that, it's important also to try to provide some information in Norwegian. But in very specialized fields, I'm not necessarily have to go into details, but it should be possible for if politicians from the national level is interested, it should be able to understand at least to some extent what are you really working with, because you have it's funded from probably from Norwegian government and so on. So it's to some extent I still think it should be available. And to make it more complicated, we also was criticized for not having websites in norsk. So that is also even more complicated.
But how do we, so in principle, I think many people would agree with what you're saying, but how do we achieve it? Because if you look at the reality, in many cases, these websites do not exist in Norwegian because of resource demands and so on, and often project leaders are not so interested in spending time writing these summaries in Norwegian, for example. How do we work to enable a culture where this is seen as something that we naturally do? What can we do to create that kind of environment where people don't see it as a hassle, but as a natural thing to do?
When you get research funded from the government or from EU or something, it could be a part of the obligation. If you don't provide the websites in both languages, you won't you won't get funded. I mean, that's a very hard way to do it, but I think it's a cultural problem, really. Why should we do it? Yes, because we are a part of the society.
Right.
So it's both. You could use very tough incentives, but you could also discuss it, and if people understand why, it's not that complicated to have someone to make a Norwegian summary.
Right.
It isn't that time consuming. So it's a matter of priority, I think.
Yep. And you mentioned this earlier as well, Monica, that the existing language policy guidelines are not too bad. We are revising them. We're going to suggest some changes, but we're not going to turn them upside down. I think it's fair to say that at this point. But you also said, and I think this is the key, that many of them are not followed, or they are not practiced the way they should be. So we've touched upon this a little bit, but how do we make sure that they're actually followed? For example, the requirement to learn Norwegian. In some places, because the working language in English, or there are so many internationals that it's easier for everyone to use English. How do we work to make sure that the organization will actually use these guidelines in their daily life? I mean, the guidelines relate to research, they relate to teaching, they relate to administration. So there are many layers, and there obviously is no single answer that will answer to all these layers. But do you have some ideas about how we can generally encourage the institution to follow them?
Oh, it's a responsibility for us as the managers on different levels, I think. And it's a very good start to have this webinar to discuss it. So just be aware of, I guess a lot of people are not even aware of the guidelines. So that's a good start to remind us of what the guidelines are. And how we prioritize. It's a question of how are you follow up. So if we are asked in what way have you in your department, if the rector or the dean come and ask you about how do you work with the guidelines the last year, you have to answer something, and then it's a more important part of the agenda. But if nobody talks about it, we will just forget it. So that's a first step, I think, to put it on the agenda, and things that we ask leaders about these questions on various levels.
I think I think there is a lack of information, because I never heard about language policy before this revision started. So yeah, there should be some mention in the PhD handbook maybe that this is the language policy of NTNU. I just found one line in there that faculty is responsible to make people aware that they should communicate in Norwegian, but there was just one line. That's it. So I think there should be some mention in the PhD handbook about the language policy. And otherwise, you won't be able to implement it in every level if people are not aware of it. So yeah, that's my point.
Thank you. Vikas?
In line with Monica and Payal, I think we need to make people to follow the guideline. We need to make them aware it exists. That's where it starts. Once people know that it exists, we need to talk about it regularly. It shouldn't be once a year type of thing. It needs to come in our day-to-day regular business, as Monica was in. If we have it's part of our yearly plan, årsplan we call it in Norwegian, then there should be very concrete target objective saying that this is what we shall try to achieve. And then dean and department heads have a good dialogue about it. We also report what we have achieved over a year. It should become a regular practice. It shouldn't be a one-time event that we talk about it and we forget.
Right.
Existence of guideline, you are into that. That's important. We need to use all those channels like Teams channel, INSEA, webinar. And this is amazing. We should have several panel debate. I suppose that's important. And creating a lot of teasers involving students would also be important, I think. But you're quite right. Existence of guideline is people need to be aware of, and it should be easy to follow. And that's what Terje, you are working together with the committee to make it even easier to follow. The one we have is very good, but there's always room for improvement.
Right.
Yep.
And I think we can, I guess, disclose one thing that we've talked about, at least, without saying exactly how we will word it. But that's what you're talking about when you talk about strategic objectives and the yearly plan and so on, that in many cases, there is no mention of language and language policy in those plans. And maybe we need to start by addressing it there, because the answer in 2017 might be another one than what the answer to the question should be in 2022, because the staff changes and there might be more or fewer internationals. So you might need a more flexible approach as well, so that what you decided on 5 years ago is not necessarily the right way to do it now.
And as I said, it will differ between different faculties, different departments. So there's not one answer, but to just have, well, how do you work with the guidelines? What are the problems? Are there anything we can provide from the NTNU level? So just to have the discussion and be aware of. Actually, when I tried to read through the guidelines before we had the debate, I had to Google a couple of times before I actually found them. So it should be very easy, very available guidelines.
Right.
If I may add,
please.
NTNU has good ambition regarding onboarding of new staff members. Yeah. And it's a very important thing that we have a good onboarding. And I think each department, faculty is into this. Perhaps we should have this language guidelines and also a part of onboarding, so that from day one, our new staff members are aware where guidelines are and what type of possibilities NTNU can offer to them. I don't think language is part of the onboarding per today, right. But this is something we need to investigate and integrate in our onboarding process.
Right. Yeah. And I also like the suggestion that one of you mentioned earlier, namely that maybe those who need to learn Norwegian, that we need to adapt a bit more and give them maybe a bit less teaching than we currently do, because many, I think, feel that they have to learn Norwegian in addition to everything else. Yeah. And we have high expectations of our employees, so we want them to excel in teaching and research and outreach and everything in a sense. And then you're new to this place, you have your own really high ambitions, and then language learning is often not prioritized, or there's not enough space. And that's an issue that we have talked about in the committee as well, that we need more spaces or more seats in the relevant courses. But maybe we also need to think a bit about how we how we adapt and how we think of their workload in the first 2 or 3 years to encourage language learning?
Yeah. I don't think the answer is, as someone had suggested, to say have just 2 years. That is a very bad suggestion, but because it takes time and people are different. It differs where you come from, what are your native language, and so on. But so 3 years, but it should also be a follow-up after 3 years. I don't think we're very good at that either. So after 2 years, if you still don't understand Norwegian, what happens? Nothing. Exactly. So that's also important. So if you don't, you should have some more courses, some more follow-up coaching, whatever, so we actually reach a certain level. Right. We have employees who have been here for 30 years and still not very good in Norwegian, and that is our responsibility.
Right. And then that brings me to another question that we've received from the audience, which is, if someone struggles or is not super willing, I mean, those individuals also exist, and that's a fact, I think. How long should we accommodate? So if you've been here for, say, 5 years and you've tried, so maybe you've tried and you didn't succeed, or you haven't really prioritized it because you had such ambitious research and teaching plans, how long should we adapt, and how should we approach this kind of situation? Should we just switch to Norwegian if that's the only person that doesn't really master it, or how do we navigate such a concrete case?
Yes.
Vikas?
Again, dialogue is the key here, and we can provide language courses, but we also need to figure out what is causing the struggle.
Right.
Because everyone has their different background, different situations, so we need to understand that as well. Different culture, as you said, and Monica as well, coming from India and learning one European language is not easy compared to one coming from Netherlands and learning Norwegian. So there can be different pace, different tempo to learn the language. So, and important to make Norwegian or making a language a positive thing. Right. Yeah. It shouldn't be given as a obligation or burden. Make it positive. It shows the value of learning a language such as Norwegian. Feeling of mastery is the key. Right. Most of non-Norwegian speakers stop learning this because it's not easy to struggle like a 5-year-old kid when you're a 30-year-old, and there it comes down to how the support environment is around the stuff, that an individual. An exact timeline is not relevant, I think, even though it's written in the guide and recruitment that within 3 years we need to master the Scandinavian language, but the timeline can vary depending on individuals. During the pandemic, there has been limited access to socialization, language courses. It is the employer's responsibility, our responsibility, to encourage and facilitate for learning Norwegian, and we must be flexible. That's my attitude towards this question.
Right.
It should be part of the yearly talk with the employees, medarbeidersamtale. So if you say, okay, you need 4 years, but we will provide you with more coaching and so on, or other people will need 2 years, but it should be an individual follow-up issue, and try to understand what is the problem. Another practical thing is, I think we have, maybe it has changed, but it used to be a problem that in Gjøvik, Ålesund, they only had online courses because we provide them from Trondheim. That is not good enough. You need to have, because if you learn a language, you need to communicate physically, I think. Yeah. So that is also, so we need to have good enough courses. That is number one, and then everything else is follow-up and individual adjustments and so on.
And there is an additional difficulty which I think many people often don't talk about. Both of you might have experienced this, which is the rich dialect diversity in Norway. Because one thing is to learn how to read Norwegian and maybe to understand the news in bokmål. But another thing is to understand the differences between Monica's Norwegian and my Norwegian, which it often creates difficulties. And maybe we who speak Norwegian natively need to be more attentive to that and try to do what we often don't do, namely accommodate a little bit, which there is no real culture to do in Norwegian or in Norway, but maybe that's something that we also can do, because now we've talked a lot about what the internationals can do and how we can help them, but maybe this is another simple thing that we can at least occasionally try to speak a bit slower, or you know, not use the most peculiar endings on words that create difficulties and so on. Even if there, of course, there's a richness and a great thing to having the dialect diversity as well, it is harder from a learning point of view.
Absolutely.
I agree on that. And this can happen with both Norwegian and English.
Yes.
That if you meet one from UK who is very articulated, and then we can struggle even to understand all the words in English. So from a personal experience, I can say that my better half comes from Western Norway, and she has a very strong dialect. So every time I visit her family, I still feel that I can't Norwegian, even though I've been living in this society for almost 18 years. As you said, dialect can be challenging at a time to understand. And then they switch to English, even though I've been here for so many years. But that's how, again, it's about understanding each other and supporting each other so that we keep the communication going.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to add one more thing. I think there is a lack of funding also from departments. So right now my department is just supporting for level 1, which is A1 and A2. But if you want to speak fluent Norwegian, A1 and A2 is not enough for that. So it is employers' responsibility to help us with the funding. So I think there should be one central rule for all the departments. It shouldn't be handled separately. That, okay, one department is just paying for level 1 and other department is paying for both level 1 and level 2. It shouldn't be like that. So there should be one central funding for all the language courses for the employees.
That is quite a common problem at NTNU, to standardize. Not very good at that in all kinds of subjects.
Yeah.
But it is an important point. It's something we've talked about in the committee as well, that some people get their courses covered and others don't. One last thing that I would like to bring up, which we haven't touched upon, is the tacit and implicit assumption that all Norwegians speak English either perfectly or well enough, or at some level that suffices. So we always talk about internationals needing to learn Norwegian, but what about Norwegians who might need to improve their English skills? What kind of responsibility do you think NTNU should have or take in that regard?
Yes, that's a good point.
Is it a valid assumption that we all are so good in English that we don't need to develop? I mean, I said something else in my introduction, so I guess you can see what I think. But what do you think?
I think most people working with research are usually quite good. They're good in English when they talk about their own research, because you're used to write in English. You're used to going to international conferences to present your work and so on. But it's much more complicated when you're discussing administrative issues or human resources or everyday life. So the vocabulary on various themes is different. So yes, I think we also have in departments with huge number of international where English is the important language. We'll also have a responsibility to improve our English skills.
Thank you. I think that brings us towards the end. So I would like to thank the participants for their valuable contributions. We are now going to take a 10-minute break before we return for the second panel debate, which will be in Norwegian. Thank you.